welcome to our panel discussion on crisis response during an election, brought to you by global election technology leader Smartmatic and the National Preparedness Leadership Initiative at Harvard. I'm Michelle Shafer, and I've worked in the election technology space for over 2 decades, focused in the areas of communication and research. Today, I'll be talking with a fantastic panel of experts in election administration and crisis management. During this session, you'll hear actionable advice from this group on responding to unforeseen events as we march toward Election Day. As we begin this panel, on behalf of everyone assembled here today and our panel's organizers, we'd like to acknowledge election officials and poll workers everywhere for the critically important and mostly unrecognized work they do to uphold democracy in our country. Elections officials are the ultimate crisis managers, and we thank them all for their service. I'm going to introduce each panelist now and invite them to share a few introductory points they'd like to make regarding our crisis response in an election topic. We're going to start with Alice Miller, Executive Director of the District of Columbia Board of Elections. Alice also serves on the board of the National Association of Election Officials, better known as the Election Center. Alice has also held an executive position with the U.S. Election Assistance Commission. Alice, thank you so much for being here and taking time out of your work in the district to share your expertise with our audience today.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you all for inviting me. I'm very happy and pleased to be here. Just a little bit, as you indicated, I'm currently at the director for the Board of Elections. We have about 500,000 active voters here. Responsibilities include administering the full election process for members of our voter roll, and that is the recruiting poll workers, candidate qualification for ballot access, registering voters in the whole 9 yards. We also go through identifying polling places and everything. So the District of Columbia, unlike other state level entities, has both the local and the state responsibility. So it's a dual kind of double-edged sword that we've been going through all year. We're certainly happy to be getting to the end of it, but it's been a challenge, and I will say that. And having said, I will say one of the things that we know that we've learned in going through this transition is to make sure that we are always communicating with our voters, always communicating with the elected officials, always communicating with members of the public, and making sure that our messages are clear, making sure that we are setting clear expectations, and ensuring that anyone that needs information has it and that they have it from the source within which they need to get it from, so that it's accurate and that it's clear. We've gone through a lot this year. We've learned a lot, and all of those lessons learned, we will move forward as we get toward into the November election and through it. Thank you.
Thank you, Alice. Really appreciate you being here. Next, we have Ed Smith, Smartmatic's Director of Global Services and Certification in North America. Prior to joining Smartmatic, Ed served in leadership positions with multiple election technology providers. He currently serves as a member of the Executive Committee of the Election Infrastructure Sector Coordinating Council, and he's also served as a member of the Technical Guidelines Development Committee of the U.S. Election Assistance Commission. Ed, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Michelle. It's a pleasure to be here. I've been in the elections industry for just under 20 years, and prior to that, I led a division at a Houston area manufacturer that manufactured voting machines for one of the current technology providers. As a voting systems provider, I've worked primarily in operations and certification, and I just finished leading the second VSAP certification effort on behalf of the Los Angeles Registrar, Recorder, and County Clerk's Office. I've been through, as you have, some interesting situations in elections, certainly some that could be deemed a crisis. And while that oft used phrase, vote early, vote often, used in humor and jest, applies there and is a bad idea, I'd like to apply it to communications, where it's really a good idea to communicate early and communicate often. Don't vote early and often, but communicate early and often. Thank you.
Thanks, Ed. That's good advice. And thank you for being with us today and sharing your knowledge. Last but certainly not least, we are extremely honored to have Rich Serino with us. Rich is the Distinguished Senior Fellow at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health's National Preparedness Leadership Initiative. Rich has an extremely impressive crisis response background outside of elections. He served as Deputy Administrator for FEMA, as well as the Chief of Boston's Emergency Medical Services, Rich, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks, Michelle. It's a pleasure to be here. And I'm sure a lot of people are saying, well, what is Rich doing here? He's not an election official and he has voted a lot, but that's about the extent. But as we start to look at how elections, especially this election, and how we start to look at crisis and crisis leadership and responding to crisis, there's certain things in emergency management and public safety that we do all the time. And we look at how we prepare, how we mitigate, how we respond, and how we recover from disasters in general. And a couple of quick points, I'll go into some more later, but one of the things that we always say is we never really want to exchange business cards at the scene of a disaster. So in this election, we certainly don't want to be exchanging business cards the day of the election. We want to make sure people get to know people ahead of time, get to know the important parties in the crisis before the crisis happens, and just to understand exactly what you're able to do, where you're able to go, and who is part of the team that you're meeting, and meet with them ahead of time. Have a plan, develop that plan. Mitigation, how do we mitigate? And by communicating the plan and understanding that not things might go wrong, just assume something is going to go wrong and have a plan for that. And how you're able to continue to prepare as you start to look at things that may happen, and you start to look at how you're able to, look at the response of the day, specifically the day of the election. Have your plans in place, communicate those plans as you heard earlier, communicate with the public, but communicate with your staff, communicate with the poll workers there so they know what the plan is. And also, we're doing this in the middle of COVID. What are your plans to work with COVID? How are you going to keep people safe? How are you going to keep your poll workers safe? In recovery, is what aspects are you going to want to do once the polls close? And is it going to continue? Some places it's going to continue for not just hours, it could continue for days and weeks, and look at some of the aspects of that. And we'll get into some of those more details as we continue our conversation this afternoon.
Thanks so much, Rich. And thanks again to all of our panelists for making the time to be with us today. So before we dive further into some specific questions, I'd like to invite our audience to please use Zoom's Q&A feature to pose questions to our panelists, as we've reserved some time for questions toward the end of our discussion. Also, Smartmatic is recording this live webinar, and we'll be sharing the link with you via email, and we'll be posting that so you can go back and review and also share the presentation. US elections are complicated, even under normal circumstances, even though our nation's election officials, like Alice, make them look simple. Each state, territory, and the District of Columbia conduct their elections locally and have their own state election laws, procedures, deadlines, technologies, and allowed voting methods. Many things can go wrong due to people, processes, or technology, or some combination thereof. And so preparedness is really key. The best way to deal with a crisis and responses to it is by being prepared in advance. So that's what we're going to talk about today. Elections during a pandemic are even more complicated, as Rich said, and the potential for problems looms much larger. Thankfully, election officials and technology providers have been gearing up for this first presidential election during a pandemic in over 100 years. So they're ready, and we want to make sure that everybody listening is ready. So Alice, let's start with you. And on the topic of voting during a pandemic, how has COVID-19 affected your team's preparation for this election? And what do election officials still have time to do right now, these 28, 27 days before the election in terms of, before election day in terms of preparedness?
Yeah, so we've had a number of things that we've had to obviously adjust as we process the election in this environment. First of all, we've had to make sure have enough PPE for all of our polling sites, all of our poll workers, and even voters, in terms of voters coming to vote without having masks. We need to make sure we're sanitizing behind each voter. Any voter that is using our touchscreen machines, for example, our voter assistance clerks have been trained and are being trained to sanitize with alcohol wipes behind each and every voter. We've had to make certain that the voters who don't have masks are offered masks. If they refuse to wear a mask in the polling place, which is required, we won't turn them away, but instead the poll workers are being taught to process the voter outside as a curbside voter, so that voters will in fact vote, but will just not be allowed inside the voting precinct. We've had to apply the social distancing signs and make poll workers and voters aware that that is going to happen. So the 6 feet social distancing signs are not only within the precinct, but also outside of the polling location to remind voters to stay 6 feet apart. And also we will be incorporating the social gathering limitations as they exist in the District of Columbia. So someone will have to actually start counting as people come and go, as you've seen in some of the grocery stores and in other environments with respect to where, crowds may gather and people may come, just to make sure we are maintaining the limits where they need to be. This is something, of course, we've never had to do before. With our workers also, obviously we're doing the 6 foot distancing. So we have one worker at, for example, a check-in table and a ballot box table, whatever the distribution is, because the tables are 6 feet apart. So we can use those tables to measure and make sure that there's no more, there aren't any additional individuals there that need to be there. That here again is a change. In the past, we've been able to put as many as 2 or 3 people at one table, as opposed to just one, which of course means we need more tables, more chairs, and more of it, everything else. So, those are some of the things that obviously has changed the way we process our voters. This time around for the November election, in light of the pandemic, we are in the District of Columbia mailing everybody a ballot. They do not have to choose to vote that way. We will open a number of early vote centers and a number before Election Day, as well as vote centers on Election Day, meaning again, that we're not operating precincts. Anybody can vote anywhere in any location in the District of Columbia, which again is totally new for Election Day. But that's the way we had chose to do it in light of the fact that we thought we would not have poll workers, but in fact we got an onslaught of poll workers who have volunteered. But many of our poll workers are new. They're not our older veteran poll workers, understandably. Why? Because those workers fall into the category of at risk. But the younger folks did step up, and we're happy to know that. But that leads to a question of experience with them. A little bit slower with the training, but we're happy to have them. We're glad they stepped up, and they'll be manning our precincts, our polling locations. So fortunately, we do have what we need to get this done. All of this is new. All of this is different, but we're figuring out how to get through it. Just in terms of what to offer, I would say it's really, really important for all election officials to set expectations. And I think that's major. I still believe that even though we have mailed everyone a ballot and we are encouraging early voting and we're encouraging folks to either mail their ballots back or put them in a mail ballot drop box or whatever, I believe there are going to be lines, lots of lines on Election Day and during early voting. And I think that it would be irresponsible for us not to let that be known, and for voters to bring their patience when they come to vote, should they choose to come vote on Election Day or at any point to show up in person. They're going to need to be patient because it's going to take time. It takes time just from the perspective that we have to sanitize everything, the social distancing and the social gathering. So that's one takeaway I think is important, is to make sure clear expectations are set so that there's not that high level of frustration when voters are made to wait an extra long period of time for voting. It's just going to happen.
And Alice, how are you getting that messaging out and setting that expectation? How are you getting that out there for to the voters? Because there's a lot of noise out there.
Yeah, there's a lot of noise, but we have mailers going out. We have door hangers. We have our voter guide. We are doing social media. We have radio ads. I've done quite a number of community meetings with civic organizations and our local groups, our local political groups. And every time I talk, I'm saying, be prepared to wait. Pass that message on, send it to your listservs, make sure that everyone knows it's your choice to vote how you choose to vote. No one's telling you which way to vote, what's the safest way to vote, but understand there are going to be lines should you decide to vote on election day or in person during early voting. I just think that is so important because we're used to microwave fast, and it is just not going to happen for this election. That's part of what's different.
Mhm.
It's going to be a long wait, and the other part of that wait is going to be results. The results are not going to be as quick as they have been in the past. It's going to take some time to do that because of the number of mail ballots that have gone out nationwide and the time that's going to take to process those ballots. We always say, and you know this, Michelle, accuracy over speed. So we're going to get it right. We're going to take our time. We're going to do it right. It's going to be accurate, and it's going to take as long as it needs to take, but it's going to be correct and not fast.
Thank you, Alice. That's great. And yes, and it's not too late for election officials and other stakeholders listening in to know that it's not too late to get the communication out there. In fact, if you're not doing it right now, it is too late. So that's some great tips for everyone. Alice, thank you. Ed, how has the pandemic affected your team's preparation for this election? And what are some key pieces of advice that you can share that election officials and others still have time to consider implementing?
Sure, Michelle. So it certainly has affected our planning and preparation. It's brought new challenges to the fore, challenges of keeping people protected. And we've had to look at it from an entire election life cycle standpoint, from people in the back office doing ballot layout and preparation, to warehouse crews, to the election workers and the voters throughout. And then once again, after election day and the polls close, once again back to tabulation and results reporting. All of those folks have traditionally been in rooms, sometimes in close quarters, and that relative to the pandemic are polar opposites. It's created a need for more outdoor vote centers, careful layout of all the vote centers and precincts to funnel voters. I like to use that verb, funnel voters, into proper practices such as use of PPE prior to entering the polling place, single flow direction, social distancing. And those are points that Alice made as well, and I'd like to amplify one of those points in particular, and that is that election officials need to be prepared to deal with the likelihood that some voters will actively refuse to follow procedures for PPE and other aspects of safe in-person voting. That can create a disturbance at the polling place. The voter can complain that their rights are somehow being violated and lead to a crisis communications event. So jurisdictions need to be prepared to deal with how to provide access to the ballot box when someone refuses to comply with those COVID-19 related safety procedures they've put into place. And that may be outdoor ballot marking, as Alice pointed out, special areas within the polling place. I call them swim lanes. You bring people to a special area through the lanes and the arrows you've put together for flow control and social distancing. You've got to train those staff leads, polling place leads in particular, to deal with the situation as non-confrontationally as humanly possible. A lot of patience, once again, and get those voters processed and back out the door quickly. So those are just a few words on how to deal with that situation, which I think is sadly inevitable. In addition, as Alice pointed out, there are some safe in-person voting techniques that I think have become pretty universal across this nation. Moving check-in stations further away from the voting equipment to allow for distancing, maybe even in another room, expanding curbside or drive-up outdoor voting, wayfinding on the floor, signage to improve traffic flow, and stop stations at entry doors and exit doors to allow the voter a moment to pause and make sure that they are ready to enter the room, or if they're already in the room, enter into the voting area. And then once they leave, to be able to apply some hand sanitizer and be prepared to now go home and feel comfortable and safe that they're not bringing any virus back home with them.
I think that's great. Thank you, Ed. One of the things that really struck me after having served as a poll worker in my local jurisdiction for many years is being armed with that information on how to deal with a potential confrontation, difficult situation, sort of those internal communications between the election office and the frontline election workers, because not all of them are skilled in election technology or anything like that. My son is going to be a poll worker this year, so I think that kind of training of those workers so that they know how to handle those potential situations and diffuse them is really critical. And I'm sure Rich, as we go to the next question, has more to add on that. Rich, you've led the response to major national crises, including Hurricane Katrina and the Boston Marathon bombing. What specific advice can you share with election officials on this?
Well, I think one of the important things is for the lead election official at each polling site is to, first of all, don't panic, stay calm, because if you start to panic, then the whole staff is going to start panicking as well. And as I also mentioned, take the opportunity now to do some of that preparing and planning. Look at having what we call tabletop exercises. So go through various scenarios that could happen that day. You know, everything from that, if there's possibly voter intimidation, if there's any of that going on, what are you going to be able to do? And as Alice and Ed both mentioned earlier, is that looking at getting that information out ahead of time to let people know that it is safe and that people are going to be able to get there. And it is going to take time and slow, but have a plan for that and understand that when if an emergency happens, call 911. But if you need to get in touch with the police, have them as part of the tabletop exercise ahead of time. You know, not necessarily always call 911. If you have a phone number for the local precinct, and I'm talking police precinct or district or division, whatever it is, the local captain or lieutenant or sergeant, the one in the area, so you're calling that person that day so you can have a relationship with them. And then start to think about, as you're communicating the plan, not just to the public, but to your staff. I mentioned earlier about that things might go wrong, but what are you going to do if something does go wrong? Running through the scenarios ahead of time. We have something we teach called meta leadership. In part of meta leadership, we talk about swarm leadership, and there's 5 points to that. It's the unity of mission, and the unity of mission for this is to have a safe election. And then the second is that generosity of spirit and action. How can I help you succeed? What can I do to help you get better? How can we all help each other? And then stay in your lane and help others succeed. And how you can, you're in your lane, but somebody needs some help over there, how you're able to do that. Having no ego, no blame. Not when something, goes great or goes bad. It's all working together, not blaming somebody else for something. And ego, we've all seen a few people with ego in this work, but making sure that we continue that and having that foundation of trust and relationships ahead of time so that you're able to work through a lot of the issues ahead of time. You know who the people are. We still have weeks ahead of time to reach out to people that you should know and understand that and have those plans in place. Continue to communicate throughout the day. In crisis, the communication is key, not just to the public. That's very important ahead of time, the day of, but also so every poll worker, every election official knows what the plan is, and be prepared for the unexpected. Some of these days are going to be very, very long days, and it's easy to get lax, especially with COVID. One thing we want to make sure is don't get lax throughout the day. And if you're going to have legal presence, if that's going to be controversial, have who's the protest liaison officer, have somebody who understands what you're able to do. And as we start to go into some long-term recovery, and by long-term, in this case, I mean, past that night, is start to think of the workers, taking care of the workers and food and the space that you need, the hours that you're going to need, be able to make sure that they're able to be taken care of. So as we start to look at all these different points, it's very similar to how we respond to disasters and certain things that you're able to do in this instance of this election, and that is somewhat analogous to how we respond to disasters. The tools that we use in response to these critical incidents, whether they be the major hurricane or the marathon bombing, tornadoes, is the same that we can use, the same simple procedures of how we prepare, how we respond, how we mitigate, and how we're able to recover. And we go into this election using some of those tools is going to help quite a bit.
Thank you, Rich. And I think it would be helpful if you shared your phone number with everybody on this call and let us know where you're going to be on election night. I'm kidding. But having somebody like you for people to talk to who are on the front line in these crises, I think it's important that everybody has a go-to person and resources on their list so that you don't feel like you're alone. I think that community of spirit that really speaks to how election officials work, and I think that's fantastic advice, Richard. Thank you.
Thanks. I think people just remembering that day, and it's hard, and the
Yes.
planning you do ahead of time is going to make a huge difference in meeting the key folks.
Yes. All right. Well, changing gears a little bit from COVID, there's still a lot of other potential issues that can crop up on election day, as we all know. Ed, from a technology and cybersecurity perspective, how do you suggest election officials and technology providers continue to prepare in these final days before November 3rd?
Sure. I still think there are a number of things that election officials can do. First is prepare for heightened disinformation. The quantity of it, the tone of it, how detached from reality the disinformation will become is going to do nothing but increase, and having some preparation for that is certainly important. Once again, getting out in front of it and visiting with your local editorial boards, your local news media of all sorts, which may include some circles you haven't thought of, leading social media, so-called influencers in your area, bloggers. It might make sense to contact them as well. Something that I know some jurisdictions are thinking about and wrestling with is that voters will be using equipment that is new to them. Although many jurisdictions who were using new equipment in 2020 did use that new equipment in the primary, turnout was probably lower in the primary than it will be in this November general elections. And so those voters who did not vote in the primary will be in fact using that equipment for the first time. So voter education and outreach, line cards, as Los Angeles County uses a card that they give voters when they're in the line to give them some orientation to the equipment, model equipment if you have it. All of those things can aid the voter to be prepared to have a good voting experience when they see that for the first time. And amplifying messages that come from the federal government and your state government. I noticed that CISA, the DHS agency, other government agencies are now promoting this 3P voter curriculum: prepared, participating, and patient. Are messages that they're giving to the voters to aid them both before they go to vote, meaning they plan and prepare, and then they actually do vote and perhaps even work as an election worker. And then finally, as the polls close and we move into the next phase where we get the results and the canvassing of the election, that voters are patient. So that's just one example of this new training that various groups are essentially giving to voters. And we need to mirror and amplify that new training in those messages.
Thank you, Ed. Alice, we talked a little bit about this in the response to the previous question, but what are some additional key messages that you feel voters need to hear about the election process this year to help avoid the appearance of a crisis?
Right. So I do want to pick up on one thing that Richard said that I think is so very important, at least as it relates to election officials and globally to all of us, and that is the idea that we are all in this together, that we are all supporting each other, that no one, is trying to get a head up or shine in front of anyone else. And everyone, you, Michelle, Ed, this as well from an election official's perspective, we all work very closely together as colleagues, as individuals who want to help and want to respect and promote each other. So with that in mind, I think that needs to extend to the voters and try to make them understand that, we're working with them, they need to work with us, and we need to all work with each other. Everyone's in this whole game right now together. It's a team effort. We need to pull together and work together to get this done. I know from the election official perspective, as maybe as unreal as it may feel, election officials just want to get it done. They just want the job done. And they don't care who wins or who loses. They just want to be able to say, at the end of the day, they can show that the process was not tampered with, that it was clear, that it was the integrity of the process was maintained. And that is very, very important to everybody who puts their heart into doing this. There are many, many sleepless nights that everyone working in this field has, and not just individuals at the state level in terms of the head of the election offices, but I mean those down in the weeds that are literally in the warehouse preparing the ballots and opening them and putting envelopes together and looking at and verifying signatures. Everyone has put their heart into this. And at the end of the day, the last thing anyone wants is to think that the work that they have put into this has gone just like unnoticed or not appreciated, because everyone knows from the election officials' perspective, we work well, we work hard, we work as a team, and we need everyone to join in on that team. And from a media perspective, there are lines out there. You're gonna see lines, and they're gonna be reporting and shooting lines. It is helpful that when you're doing that, indicate that the lines are occurring because we're taking precautions. We're cleaning the machines, we're social distancing, we're social gathering, and we're making sure that everybody is being safely processed, that everyone has a mask. All of these things are necessary to get everyone's vote counted and to maintain the integrity of the process, and to make sure that the votes are counted and counted accurately, that the ballots are able to be cast and counted as cast. It's very, very important. The media plays a role in this. And from that perspective, we need support, not attacks from the media. I know it's never a good story unless it's a bad story, but they can help with this, especially coming up to what we're getting into with this election. And some of that requires us communicating with them and developing and establishing those relationships with them. And we know there are going to be some issues and some challenges. And I think as we identify those things, we can try to put our own spin on it before they put a spin on it, or before someone who's trying to attack and have a negative aspect of it put a spin on it. And maybe that way it'll go better. We know results are going to take a long time. They're not going to be as quickly as we've had them before. And always the election night results are unofficial results. But we know those unofficial results are going to not be as tight or as final as they normally are on election night, because we're going to have lots of mail ballots to count. And for example, our mail ballots are due in up to 10 days after the election, even though they have to be postmarked by election day. We still have up to 10 days after to get them back. So that's going to at least extend that period beyond that 10 days. And who knows how many we're going to have. Like I said, we're mailing to everybody. We have no clue because we've never done this before. So we have nothing to look at in terms of data, in terms of how many are going to send them back, how many are going to vote in person. But we know we're going to have a mound of ballots more than likely to count after election day. So it's going to mean our unofficial results, although unofficial, are going to take longer to give a tally on. We need to make sure that that's known and that that's put out there, that voters have that information. We communicate that early, and we communicate that to people that need to know, and that the media does that as well. Not a problem, nothing's wrong. We're doing what we need to do, and therefore it's taking a little bit longer, thank God, again, the accuracy over speed, kind of message. And we're doing what we need to do. So, again, the thing with the lines are long because we're doing what we need to do. We're cleaning, we're wiping, we're minimizing the numbers that come in, we're minimizing in terms of the distancing. All of that plays a key role in how the polling place operates and how the locations operate. And these messages are very, very important. If there's a problem and voters have an issue and they want to ask a question, they should go to a trusted source. the trusted source is always going to be the election office, the election official, and not someone who does not know, including the media who may not know. They need to rely on our websites, on our offices, and on information that they are receiving from election officials as the trusted source of information, to make sure that the information is not misinformation, which is a mistake, or disinformation, which is even worse than the misinformation. So that's very, very important, and I'll be quiet.
No, those are great, great messages, Alice, and they tie right in what I know Rich is going to speak about next, and that's Rich, talking to the media can be daunting for many, and I think for most people. And it's especially daunting during a crisis or potential crisis. What advice do you have to effectively respond to the media when dealing with an issue?
Well, I think a couple of points, and Alice mentioned some of them, and I'll just build upon those, is establishing that rapport with the media before the crisis. If you're the election official in your city, county, town, is to reach out to folks now and let them know that there are going to be lines so that they understand that, and have their contact number for that day, and they have yours. So you become the expert, you become the trusted source of information. As you start to develop establishing those relationships, that's going to be, important, and understand what questions that they're probably going to ask. And so you can have answers ready for that. And if you're not the best with the media, have somebody on your team that's able to speak with the media, and make sure you always, always tell the truth. If you don't know, it's simple to say, I don't know, I'll find out, I'll have somebody else get back to you, or I'll get back to you later on. Make sure you get back to them, because if you don't get back to them, they'll find somebody else. And so you want to make sure that you're able to get back to people, and when you tell them that you're going to get back to them. And with that, also have a list of third-party, what we call validators. Reach out, and that because they're going to ask, is there somebody else I can call? Because if you don't give them a name of somebody to call, they're going to find somebody, and it may not be the best person you want talking about elections. If, for example, you may want somebody on this call, somebody, some of the other participants, that is a third-party validator to understand what the issues are, and to understand so they can speak, not as the trusted source, but as a validator, because you have to be the trusted source. Alice, I just want to repeat what you said, is setting those realistic expectations for folks, making sure you have those, and we do that in disasters, but make sure you have that information out, that people understand what you're able to do. And the long lines, the mask requirements for places there are mask requirements, and letting people know that, and making sure and continue with not just communicating with the reporters, but having a social media presence. And if you don't have it now, try to develop it now, because that's one of the places that misinformation is going to spread very quickly. So you want to make sure you work to dispel that misinformation as soon as possible. And sometimes, depending on the size of your organization, you really need somebody to focus on that, because we don't need misinformation streaming out of control. The communication is key. It's not, as Ed mentioned earlier about voting, communication early, often, clear, and direct. That's communicate early, often, clear, and direct is going to be absolutely critical to let people know how you're going to be able to get through this. Communication in this election, almost more than any other, is going to be key in letting people know that it is going to take a while, that people are going to be long in lines, and as misinformation comes out, how you're able to correct that. And if you can reach out to your local media folks now and figure out who has been covering the stories in your local area, whether it's on TV, whether it's in the newspapers, reach out to them and let them know some basic information. And if you're comfortable, give them your cell phone number to say, I can give you, information now. So, and start to develop that relationship, because the day of election day and as we know, the days and weeks after is when, you want to be able to get the right information out. And, social media, having direct contact with trusted folks is going to make a huge difference. And it's something that I've used for years, both in Boston and in FEMA, having those trusted sources, reaching out to people to make sure that the right story gets out. I'm not trying to steer a story one way or the other, but getting the correct information out, reaching out to those trusted sources. And, and you're not going to contain information. You're not going to control the message. What you want to do is have the narrative out there that you want to have, that narrative that's out there, as you're able to do that.
That's fantastic. Alice and Rich, that is excellent. And I think between the two of you, you've gone through exactly what we were going to get to in this next question. So we can skip over that and go right over to Ed and ask him about, you're supporting election official customers out there in the field right now, you and your company. What can you share about how you're doing that with regard to crisis preparedness and response?
Sure. So some points that I'm giving to election officials that I'm working with is that they need to promote that the election officials are the people who are actually conducting and overseeing the election, and it's not the technology providers, the voting system providers. There are actually many different technology providers that support a given election office. There may be the voting system provider, an electronic poll book provider, a ballot printer, an election returns website. All of those are there to support the election official. But even with that, aside from the voting machines, most of the technology out there is off-the-shelf products by household names like Microsoft and Dell and HP. It's not all about the voting system providers as often people make it, especially people who are spreading misinformation. And election officials need to be taking the lead. They need to take the lead with respect to communicating with the media, and the election technology providers can be a backup to them, can be of aid to them when called upon, but the election official and their staff need to take the lead to do that media communication. Those are some of the communications points that I'm giving to election officials.
Thank you, Ed. I think those are, excellent tips to provide. I want to take this opportunity to remind everybody again, we have a little bit of time for Q&A. So if you haven't submitted a question yet, please feel free using the Q&A function on the bottom of your Zoom screen. So one of the questions that's been asked is, how can you tell the difference between an issue and a potential crisis? And is there a way to keep an issue from becoming a crisis? Is there a way to know what the media will seize on and to try and navigate that situation? Rich, do you have any thoughts on that?
Sure. I think one of the things is that, if an issue develops, if you're truthful and you're honest and you let them know the facts, that's going to hopefully avert it from becoming a crisis. Unfortunately, if there's any violence or somebody gets hurt, that automatically spins things up very quickly. So how you're able to control that quickly and be honest, and that's why I mentioned earlier is reaching out to make sure that you have the right law enforcement folks in your cell phone, that you know who to call, in order to have them handle the crisis, have them contact them, and constantly update as to what's going on. I think it's going to be absolutely key as you're able to start to learn what's happening and to share that information with folks. And a lot of public safety folks already have a framework for public safety agencies on how they're going to work with with various election officials, and they have pre-election, election day, and the post-election period. And a lot of it is, again, as I mentioned, communicating, having that relationships, developing them ahead of time, understanding what the laws are and how you're able to communicate with people, and continually able to do that. So I think that if you're able to, react to the situation quickly, professionally, and share the information that don't lie, be truthful of what's happening. That usually can take care of an incident if you're truthful. If it gets bigger, be prepared for that, and don't hesitate to call and help. from other folks.
Thank you, Rich. That's great advice. So I have more of a comment than a question from one of our attendees. And they say, and I agree with this 100%, it says essentially document. It says, I hate to bring this up, but I've been on the wrong end of this sometimes. When managing through a crisis, a lot of times things are moving so fast and decisions are being applied even faster. Taking the time to document everything during a situation is key. Unfortunately, a losing candidate may be pointing to that time to launch a challenge. There could be a lot of external factors. Documenting, that's very important to do. It's also hard to do when you're in the midst of that, with that situation. So taking the time to do that and realizing you're not in that crisis alone and that you should have a team that you're working with to help you do that. Alice, do you have anything to potentially add to that on documentation?
Yeah, I think documentation is a good thing to have. To the extent that we can document, then you have something to go back to and you have something to refer back to. You know, you have to be careful with what you document, how you document, and where it's recorded. So, but it's always good to document. You know, there's your record. You know, there's what you have, there's what you refer to, and that it has happened and that it's occurred, and here it is. So, you know, I try to document as much as possible, probably not enough, but definitely do try to document, and also have others, when I document, make sure I copy others who should have copies of the information as well, so that I'm not the sole holder of that information in the event that what did I do with it? Somebody else probably has it as well.
Mm-hmm.
And not only that, when I see things that are happening that I may not necessarily had an opportunity to document, I will ask someone else to make a note of that and document it. So yeah, I do. Yeah, I absolutely think that's a good thing to do, to have.
Excellent, thank you. Here's a good question. Rich, maybe you'd like to speak to this. Should I speak to the media about a crisis while it's happening, or only after it's resolved?
Oh, I think, you know, the sooner you speak to a crisis, the better off you're going to be in giving the factual information as it's happening, as you can. Obviously, if you have to deal with the crisis, deal with the crisis, and have somebody else speak with the media. And, you know, depending on the scope, it may be worthwhile just to follow up on the documentation, and it also goes in with the crisis, is if you can't document it, Alice mentioned, have somebody is in your planning now. We do this in disasters all the time. We have somebody, you know, somebody to take situation, somebody that just documents everything as it's happening, to have somebody else that, if you have the ability to do that, especially during the crisis, just to take notes, to have that, somebody that you're able to work with. Whether it's on election day, certainly after the election day, is have somebody just documenting what's happening, how, why a decision's made. Is going to make a huge difference later on. And, you know, as you start to, you know, looking at the crisis, speak about the crisis, you know, as it's happening. Sometimes you can avert it from becoming a larger crisis, because sometimes, I know it's shocking, sometimes the media may misreport it sometimes.
Yes. So speaking of that leads into this question. Someone is asking, how important is it for the local, say, polling place in the situation, for the local polling place and the local election jurisdiction to communicate and cooperate pre-election? Should the police be familiar with voting regulations, polling place hours, any kind of security or anything? How close, whether they're protesters or just bystanders, can be to a polling site? I know each state has different rules on that. Alice, what is your level of coordination with the facilities that are operating, where your polling places are operating?
Yeah, so we always communicate with MPD, the Metropolitan Police Department, before each election, and they are on standby. They're not there at the vote centers at all, or the polling places. They are on standby should something come up that we need them to get in the middle of. We haven't had a lot of that in the past, you know, very, very few where police have had to get involved. Normally, our election workers can handle these little minor disruptions that generally occur between campaigns. And usually it's local campaigns, nothing on a national level. It's normally something about a spacing issue with respect to not violation of the 50-foot guidelines where we have a 50-foot limit. You can't campaign within a 50-foot limit. And maybe one campaign may step over or something, or have someone with a t-shirt on that's outside of, within the limits. Those are normal little things. I'm not so sure how that's going to play out this year based on some of the things that we've been hearing. But we always are in close contact with our local MPD, and they know election day, you know, to just be on alert. We also have where we have staff going to, in the city, there is a viewing spot where someone can go and see the whole city and what's going on around the city. And so we have staff located there just to keep an eye on things and get a kind of sense of what, if there's anything. Again, it's been fairly calm and we've not really had any reason of concern, but we just do it just to make sure, to get a pace on things and make certain that if there's something going on, we'll hopefully have a heads up on it. I think it's important for whoever is in charge of a polling location to know what their course should be if they need to make an emergency call. We generally tell them to start with us. And if it's a real emergency, obviously they need to call 911 because we can't get there as quick as the police can, because many of them are, you know, in closer proximity than the election officials are. But start with us, and then we'll make a determination, or if they think they really need to, again, to call 911. Police are generally just cruising around. They do not interfere with our polling locations and with our voting process at all. That is not something that they do, and they know not to do that. But they do know election day, and to have, you know, antennas up and to be aware of things that might disrupt.
Just to follow up briefly on that, I think one point is that looking at, you know, a lot of cities and police departments either have what they call unified command centers or emergency operations centers that are open on election day throughout the day and evening and night. Many cities are doing that in some states. It'd be worthwhile for election officials if they could have a representative at that EOC, Emergency Operations Center, or the Unified Command Center, or whatever it's called in your jurisdiction, to have a representative in that room to know what's going on citywide, even if it's not at a polling place, to understand what's going on, and vice versa, so they can share you can share information to them much quicker as well.
See, Rich, that's the name of the place. It's the Unified Control Center. I knew it had those names, but that's it. That's where we have our staff. Yeah.
I figured that.
There you go. Thank you.
That's great. Alice or Ed, if you want to jump in on this one. Someone asked, with social distancing standards, how do we make elections accessible for people with disabilities and communicate that to them in advance? Do you have any experiences from DC or Ed, in your experiences that you guys would like to share?
Well, we have interpreters in our polling locations. So, and in advance, everything also, if we're talking physical disability, I guess. So what we do is they don't have to necessarily stand in line. We put a placeholder or someone that can stand in line for them. And then when it's their turn to vote, we allow them to do that. So we have those, and then again, of course, with curbside voting, they don't have to come into the polling location at all. They can vote from their car. We have that in place for individuals with disabilities. Then again, of course, mail balloting. So no one really has to at all come to a vote location. They can vote by mail and put their ballot either in the mail or at a ballot drop box, or anyone else can, in our jurisdiction, can deposit the ballot for them. So those are some of the things. I mean, we do realize individuals with disabilities have to be accommodated. And if there's anything that we can do to accommodate, we try our best to do that. But those are just, some of the things that come to mind offhand.
That's great. Thanks. Ed, do you have anything to add to that you've seen out there that would be helpful?
I do, and social distancing has certainly added a new wrinkle to ensuring accessibility and access to the ballot box. So it starts, before the days of COVID, it starts well before the first day of early voting. How you plan, how you lay out your polling place, how you consider, I mentioned the life cycle of the election from ballot layout to results reporting and all of the steps and facilities in between. It's the same here with the voter. What is the life cycle of the voter as they interact with the polling place, from how they approach the parking lot from the street, how they park, how they enter the polling place, how they move about successfully while they're in the polling place, and then how can they exit, get back to their vehicle, and ultimately exit the facility in whole. So that's two dimensions that you have to look at, is planning early and considering the entire life cycle of the voter as he or she undertakes the process. And jurisdictions have done certainly a better job with that. I know here in Los Angeles, they use a computer-aided design software to lay out the facilities, the vote centers, and ensure that the layouts inside are good, and they select and cite the vote centers to ensure that there's appropriate access to the polling place in the first place. Because if you can't get to the polling place, if you then can't get from the entrance of the polling place to the equipment, that equipment is not valuable to you as a voter.
Thank you. Rich, I want to give you a second to have the last word here, because we only have a couple minutes left. The question here was, how can severe inclement weather affect elections, and what kind of preparation should be in place for this? I was kind of struck by your background with some really severe weather with Katrina, and I'm sure other situations, but all election officials have had to manage through, whether snowstorms, floods, all kinds of things. But from your perspective, what do you have to say about inclement weather and getting that communication out to those voters, to those poll workers, and everybody else who needs to know?
Well, I think first off, in this year more than many others, people have an opportunity to vote early. And I think that that's going to be really important because, certainly here in New England, in Boston, that we've had snowstorms, we've had 70-degree days, and everything in between. And don't forget, one of the last presidential elections we had, back in 2012, was in the middle of Hurricane Sandy. And the elections, it was just happened literally less than a week before the election. And I was at FEMA at the time and in New York, and one of the priorities was to make sure that the polls were open. And there were places didn't have power. People were scrambling at the last minute. The election workers did amazing work in making sure that people were able to vote. So I think that, a lot of times there's a lot of unappreciated workers. And I think the poll workers, the election officials, are some of the most unappreciated workers that we've seen. And what I've seen them do, whether it's in hurricanes, storms, whatever. And now we have an extra opportunity for people to vote early, and taking that opportunity to vote early now. I know it's going to mean a lot of work for Alice and Ed and everybody else the week after, but taking that opportunity now to do that so you can vote. And weather is an issue. I mean, it's an issue everywhere. We've seen everything from wildfires in California to hurricane about to hit Louisiana now, and many others. So voting early will make a huge difference. And this election is also going to give us an opportunity to do something that that we perhaps haven't had before, is, never let it, as I say many times, never let a good crisis go to waste. Use this as an opportunity for improvement. We're in a crisis this year. I have complete faith in the election officials. I have complete faith in the public. Don't let a few people change this and deter the real facts from what's going on. So I think that, as you can take this opportunity to improve, to make things better in your community, elections are, a national election, but it's also at the hyper-local level. And what people are able to do, and people there are doing amazing work. So Thank you for having the opportunity to speak today, and thank you for the opportunity to share some of the experiences that, what we do in crisis work and disaster work is very similar to some of the things that you can utilize in the election world as well.
Thank you, Rich, and thanks to Alice and Ed. We appreciate Smartmatic and National Preparedness Leadership Initiative at Harvard for organizing this event today. And we just want to remind you to be on the lookout for an email from Smartmatic with links to this presentation and some follow-up information. So thank you, everyone.